Africa includes Israel. A portion of the land that God gave to Israel touched African soil, but not in a metaphorical, spiritual, literal, physical, or geographical sense. And if that doesn't stop you in your tracks, you haven't been paying attention to what the Bible says about the origins of these people and the beginning of this story. The second question is, which has been the subject of centuries of discussion, debate, conflict, and weaponization: did the Israelites have black ancestry? Did they have white skin? Were they in the middle? Because the answer to will vary greatly depending on who you ask. And the majority of those responses stem not from the actual text, not from the actual history, not from the actual geography, but from emotion, tradition, religion, and pride. We will therefore be doing something different today. We will go directly to the source. We're heading to the Bible. We will travel back in time to ancient times. We will travel to the actual land. And since the truth about Israel is not clear-cut, we will allow the evidence to speak without any agenda, denomination, or apology. And that's precisely the point. Let's begin at the beginning of everything. Not just the beginning of the nation of Israel. God created man from the dust of the earth, according to the Bible's Genesis. And that ground, where was it? The Garden of Eden was located where the Pidgin and the Gihon are two of the 4 rivers that flow from Eden. According to Genesis 2, according to the Bible, the Gihon encompasses all of Ethiopia. The very passage that describes the geography of creation mentions Ethiopia. A country in Africa. Europe did not create man, was not created in Asia. Through African soil flowed the rivers that nourished the first human's garden. This isn't an interpretation. The text is this: Genesis 2:13. Gihon is the name of the second river. It is the same that permeates Ethiopia as a whole in its own way. Modern science concurs with this. The earliest known human remains. Africa is where the earliest known evidence of Homo sapiens was found. The country that the Bible refers to in the garden passage is Ethiopia. The term cradle of humanity was not coined by archaeologists to denigrate Africa. The recorded archaeological reality is described in the music, the earliest evidence of fire, language, and community, as well as the oldest tools and bones. It was all discovered in Africa. Therefore, God created man from African earth through music, and the continent that would eventually be known as Africa was the ground beneath the first human being when God gave him life. On African soil, the world's first human was born. The human story begins. Their Israel is a part of the human narrative. This indicates that the origins of Israel can be traced back to the same African soil as the origins of music for all people. However, it's much deeper than that. Much deeper. The land that the Bible refers to as Israel's inheritance, the land that God promised Abraham, was not a tiny, remote area encircled by neutral territory. Take a look at what the Bible actually says about boundaries. According to Genesis 15:18, on the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "Until thy seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates." From the river of Egypt, the promised land's border began at the Nile Delta region, which is located in Africa. And the land that God gave Israel were not completely distinct, it was linked to it. That was where it all began. This explains why the music of Egypt and Israel is so entwined throughout the Bible for this reason. Abraham traveled to Egypt and was welcomed there for this reason. Joseph was sold into Egypt and ascended to the highest position. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace and was born in Egypt for this reason. Because of this, the Exodus, the pivotal event of the entire Old Testament, was a journey from Egypt, out of Africa, into a land whose boundaries started at the edge of the same African continent. God did not pick a place at random for his people. He picked a place where Africa, Asia, and the ancient world converged. A land whose roots were deeply ingrained in African soil, whose history was intertwined with African civilization, and whose inhabitants would perpetuate this African connection through generations in their physical characteristics, talis, and bloodlines. For this reason, Israel is not covenantally, geographically, or symbolically a part of Africa. At the river of Egypt, the promise started. The narrative started on African soil. Furthermore, the storytellers were not cut off from the continent where humanity originated. Now that you know the location of the land, let's discuss the inhabitants. This is where nearly everyone finds it uncomfortable, because you enter one of the most contentious discussions in religious and historical scholarship when you inquire about the Israelites' actual appearance and color. On one side, people claim to be black Africans. Those on the opposing side claim to be Middle Eastern or white. Additionally, Both sides typically arrive with little precision and a great deal of passion, so let's be specific. The appearance of several important Israelite figures is described in the Bible using a particular word. It's fair. Furthermore, very few people take the time to consider the true meaning of that word in its original context, because the whole debate regarding Israelite skin color completely shifts once you realize what it means. In the biblical passage, fair does not refer to having pale white skin. European complexion is not implied. The word fair means ruddy in both its ancient usage and its original Hebrew. Reddish chicken is what it means. It characterizes as having a warm complexion, a skin tone that reveals blood beneath the surface, and color that is full of life and tone, and that one word encompasses a variety of skin tones that most people have never thought of collectively. The fair complexion spectrum, which comprises 4 different types, has been identified by dermatologists and skin scientists who study human complexion. Music of type 1 is either very fair or extremely fair. The palest end of the spectrum is this: melanin levels are low, veins are visible, and skin burns easily in the sun. Imagine pale British, Irish, Scandinavian, and Northern European complexions. This is one end of what fair covers in terms of music. Fair skin is type 2, still light, but a little more colorful than type 1. The skin burns moderately and tans slowly. The complexion is still obviously light, but it is a little warmer than the very pale. Medium skin is type 3. The spectrum becomes intriguing at this point. There's real warmth in medium skin. It turns noisily, it retains color. It occupies the area between clearly light and clearly dark. Consider people from Southern Europe, lighter-skinned Latinos, and many Middle Easterners. Although it's clearly different from type 1, it is still within the fair spectrum. Olive or light brown skin is type 4. And for this discussion, this is the most crucial kind. The tone of olive skin is earthy, warm, and golden brown. It gives a deep tan. It is difficult to burn. It is not what most people would consider black or dark brown, but it does contain a significant amount of melanin. Many Greeks, Turks, Egyptians, Levantan Arabs, and Ethiopians with mixed ancestry come to mind. This skin tone is olive or light brown, and when the Bible refers to David as ruddy, it is describing this. Take a close look at the text. Samuel 17:42. What did Goliath see in David prior to their well-known conflict? According to the Bible, David had a fair face and a ruddy complexion. Ruddy, the original Hebrew for that word is adamini, which means warm-toned reddish brown. A pale white man would not fit this description. A dark black man does not fit this description. This describes a man whose skin is earthy, olive, sun-kissed, and warm. David's whole childhood was spent outside in the Middle Eastern sun, caring for sheep in the Judean hills. Prior to becoming a king, he was a shepherd, a man who lived outdoors in that climate and under that sun would not remain pale. The sun doesn't bargain, it intensifies the color that is already present under that sun and way of life. David's complexion would have been a deep olive, or what we refer to as type 4 sun-darkened olive, warm brown, or bronze. According to some, this same man said that was the most attractive person in Israel, the most striking, the most appealing. Additionally, he had a striking appearance with a deepened olive complexion and a warm outdoor sun. Let's now return to Abraham and Sarah. Genesis 12:11. Before they enter Egypt, Abraham tells his wife Sarah, "Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon." According to Genesis 12:14, the Egyptians saw Sarah and thought she was very fair. Sarah was impartial. It was so fair that her husband was terrified the Egyptians would kill her in order to capture her. She was so fair that the Egyptians noticed her right away. Her appearance was so remarkable that it made its way to Pharaoh's court. Here's what the majority of people overlook about this passage. Ancient Egyptians were not white Europeans. Egypt was an African civilization in antiquity. The complexion of the ancient Egyptians ranged from medium to dark brown, and they had notable African characteristics that were recorded in their own paintings, statues, and artwork. These individuals, who were people of color by any contemporary definition, were of African descent and resided in Africa. They said that Sarah was fair after glancing at her. Fair in relation to what? Fair in comparison to the Egyptian standard, indicating that Sarah's skin tone was either significantly different or lighter than that of the typical Egyptian. However, this does not imply that she was white. It indicates that her complexion was on the lighter end of the Middle Eastern and Near Eastern range. Perhaps a fair, warm-toned type 2 or type 3. not as pale as northern Europe, but lighter than the deep brown of the Egyptians of the Nile Valley. There was more than one race among the Israelites. You get two distinct points on the fair spectrum just from Sarah and David's. And this diversity within a single people is precisely what you would anticipate from a population that has spent centuries blending and interacting with neighboring civilizations at the intersection of Africa and Asia. When we reach Jesus, the dialogue, music, becomes the most intense of all. The majority of people in the West were raised to believe that Jesus was a pale white man with straight, light hair and blue eyes. Rather than reflecting the historical reality of a Galilean Jewish man in the first century, this image was created in medieval Europe and represents the European imagination of the divine, the alternative response. However, is the assertion that Jesus was black, a dark-skinned African musician. Furthermore, this assertion does not adequately explain what the biblical text actually describes. Even though it stems from a sincere desire to recover history from European distortion, the Gospels do not contain the most straightforward physical description of Jesus in the Bible. It is described in the book of Revelation as a vision that John had while on the island of Patmos. John says that this is how the exalted Christ in Revelation 1:14-15, his hair and head were as white as snow, as white as wool, his feet resembled fine brass, as though they were burning in a furnace, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet burned in a furnace like fine brass bronze, or brass is a warm, rich golden brown metal. Brass darkens and deepens into a rich, warm brown when it is burned in a furnace. Chocolate libben, burnished bronze, is the Greek word used here. Pale white skin is not this color. Additionally, jet black skin is not this color. Deep, warm, sunny, darkened olive skin is this color. Bronze brown, the color of a Middle Eastern man who traveled outside under the Palestinian sun for years, is the deep end of the type 4 fair spectrum. His hair and head were as white as snow and wool white, not mixed, not gray. White indicates that the person John saw had bronze dark feet and legs. In addition to a brilliant white head and hair, both whiteness and deep bronze brown are present in this single figure. They both belong to the same description and are both real and present. Jesus was multicolored. He is positioned at the nexus of colors in the biblical description itself. Israel itself sat at the crossroads of Africa and Asia, interacting with neighboring civilizations for centuries through mixing, and when you comprehend the origins of Israel, this makes perfect sense. A people living on the border between Africa and Asia who interact with Egyptians, Ethiopians, Canaanites, Babylonians, and others while carrying the genetic legacy of centuries of Middle Eastern life. Was not going to be all the same color in their community. They planned to play the entire fair spectrum of music. Let's now confront the black. Israel claim head-on, since it merits a precise response rather than a dismissal. When people claim that Israel was black, they are reacting to centuries of European art that depicted every biblical figure as a pale white Northern European. Erasing non-European identity from biblical history, they are reacting, musically, to a theological tradition that justified the persecution of dark-skinned people worldwide by using a white Jesus. That is a valid response. That rage is warranted. There was an eraser. It was intentional, real, and caused a great deal of harm. However, a correction to an incorrect image is more than just a different incorrect image. Accuracy is the correction. In the sense of the deep brown complexion of sub-Saharan Africa, the ancient Israelites were not black. However, they were also not white in the sense of pale skin from Northern Europe. They were a Semitic people from the Middle East with a wide variety of warm olive brown and ruddy complexions that were rooted in African soil. They lived under the Middle Eastern sun and carried every shade of the fair spectrum within their community. Now, when the Israelites are described as ruddy and fair in the Hebrew Bible and other ancient texts, they are describing people in the olive to medium range of the fair spectrum, warm, complexed, sun-darkened, possessing the physical traits of people who spent thousands of years living between Asia and Africa. Israel's color is this 4 colors, the fair spectrum, not just one, and in that spectrum, type 4, olive, light brown, sun-kissed. Bronze would have been the darkest and most prevalent shade among those who lived outside in that region under that sun. They are referring to type 4 black. The darkness they identify in the appearances of ancient Israelites, it's true, it's there. David's ruddiness, Christ's bronze feet, and the olive skin of those who lived on the edge of Africa under the Middle Eastern sun are all examples of it. However, referring to it as just black erases the complexity of what was actually present and flattens the spectrum. Here's why it's all important. Israel was not accidentally positioned at the intersection of Africa and Asia by God. It was not by accident that he started the covenant at the river of Egypt. He did not unintentionally create the first human being from African soil. The geographical location of the Bible and the physical characteristics of its main characters are linked to the idea that this narrative is universal to all of humanity, not to a particular race, skin tone, or cultural custom. Israel's African heritage, Middle Eastern reality, and the actual soil and sun that shaped its people are all cut off when it is made entirely white. The complexity of a people who were truly mixed and carried every shade of the fair spectrum across their tribes, families, and centuries is flattened when you make Israel entirely black. The truth is more beautiful and more difficult than either extreme. Israel's population was diverse, fair in the old sense, ruddy, warm, olive, bronze, sun-deepened, rooted in African earth, living under the Middle Eastern sun and bearing a people's complexion at the meeting point of two continents in actuality, is historically and biologically in the middle, neither strictly European nor strictly sub-Saharan African, and is not a compromise in the middle, it's the reality. African Egyptians were drawn to Sarah's fair, lighter complexion. David was sun-darkened, type 4, ruddy, warm, and olive. It was said that Jesus had bronze feet and white hair. In a single figure, both extremes of the musical spectrum are present, and the human story itself started at the river of Egypt. On the edge of Africa, where they all set foot, the Israel of European paintings is not like this. This is also not the Israel of contentious YouTube videos. This is the Israel of the real history, the real land, and the real text of people who were born at the meeting point of the oldest continent on Earth and the most, musically, disputed territory in human history, carrying the proof of their origins and identity in their faces, complexions, and ancestry. One people can be mixed, fair, olive, ruddy, bronze, or any other shade of warm humanity, and that people's history began in African land, was molded by African civilization, was promised a land whose borders began in Africa, and was guided by a God who created the first human being from African soil. The question of whether Israel was black or white ceases to be interesting if you truly comprehend that. The truth is that Israel was human, ancient human, the kind of human that was formed when the world was still young, and the continent that cradled all of us was the only stage on which the story was being told. Keep in mind that you already know what to do if this moved you or caused you to see something you had never seen before. This is what we do here, so please subscribe to this channel. We visit the origin, we proceed to the text. We visit the actual evidence, the land, and the history. We don't dictate to you what you want to hear. We tell you the truth. And we do it without any agenda or apology. Click the subscribe button. Give this to someone who needs to stop fighting and start reading, because the truth about Israel, where they lived, how they looked, and where their story truly started is greater and more potent than anyone claimed from any one camp. Africa is where the land originated. Africa was reflected in the people's complexion. The first human being from Africa was created by the story's God. Music that isn't a dispute, the record is that.